His Excellency Honorable Lee Kinyanjui, the Governor of Nakuru County, one of the 47 counties here in Kenya. Now, before heading the county that boasts a population of 2.1 million people, he served as a member of parliament and prior to that, assistant minister for roads in the government of Kenya. He's also the recipient of several awards, including the Friendly Governor of the Year 2020 award from the African Leadership magazine. He'll be addressing us on potentials of inclusive basic services and housing in the center of resilient, sustainable cities and communities in Africa. Governor Kinyanjui, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I wish to take this opportunity to thank the organizers and in particular the Executive Director, Maimuna, for having brought this forum together so that we can also exchange our experiences and more importantly that we can also learn from one another and inform our actions on these very difficult times. I am a governor of one of the counties in Kenya, and I'm also the chair of the infrastructure and urban planning within the larger Kenya. So we have a very big forum that also helps us to share experiences, and I think part of that is what we'll be dealing with. Allow me to start by saying that the impact of the pandemic on the urban life has been very significant because maybe we have heard about it, but nobody thought that it would ever come. So for our planners, both in housing, in public transport, in sanitation, the conversation around a pandemic remained a very distant conversation. And therefore, it is also appropriate to say that our urban centers were really not created with some of these eventualities in mind. And as a result of that, we have had a major beating, but I think out of it also are critical lessons that we can learn and possibly create and mold a better future where we become more resilient to possibilities of that nature. The first thing that we observe is that during the lockdown, certain key things happened, including people could no longer go to work. And noting that the urban people rely mainly on incomes they get so that they can buy food, they can pay rent and buy other services, then there was a serious economic crippling arising from that. And especially for the informal settlements, you now ended up with a situation where somebody who was working in a hotel, no longer working, they are at home, and therefore cannot be able to provide for their services. And that was a major issue. So lockdown had that very, very big negative impact on the economic ability of residents in cities to be able to pay for their normal services. And of course, when you contrast that with the rural people who probably live in their own house, have a small farm where they can have their kitchen garden and so on, the impact in the urban areas was definitely very bad. Secondly is on the issue of the social impact. A lot of churches were closed when it got to the peak. Social places, including bars and other socializing points, were closed. And therefore, given that human beings are also conditioned in a manner to operate with a certain aspect of them being social, when all this was closed, we saw major negative impact in the society. And part of it also was seen in increase in gender-based violence arising from some of these challenges that were brought with those closure. Bars may have their role because people in the evening would want to have a drink, and those who are used to it, when suddenly all that was closed, it became a very difficult issue. The other matter was on the urban poor, that we have very huge catchment or settlement of poor people across major cities in Africa. And as you can imagine, a lot of these cities, when it comes to our housing, adequate housing is not achieved to a great extent. And therefore, we have a lot of slums where maybe 1 or 2 room house has 5 or 6 people. So when you are in an environment of lockdown and these people cannot get out and the facilities within the house are not sufficient, and again, when you come to the other public areas, including sanitation, washrooms, and bathrooms, they are all shared. All these challenges came to the fore. And all this has put a lot of focus on we as planners and decision makers on key areas on how, moving forward, we can be able to address congestion in our urban areas. In our urban planning, how can we make the possibility of a pandemic a key issue in our planning, even for all the houses, the affordable housing programs that we are coming up with? One of the key things that had not been previously factored is a possibility that a pandemic would come. And therefore, we need to look and know that other breathing related sort of complications or pandemics can come in future. And therefore, in our planning, congestion must be addressed. And this is not just in the housing, but also in the public transport. If you look in Nairobi, for example, the public transport to Kibera, to Mathare, and many of the other urban areas, it is really a very, very, very congested route, and therefore something must be done. Common services, again, we must look at when you have a housing system where you have 10, 20, 30 families all sharing one toilet block and so on. Again, this is an area that needs to be looked at as we move forward. In the heat of the pandemic, a lot of services also went online, meaning that if the government wanted to send information or whatever it is, there was an attempt, even for education, for us to go online. And therefore, again, it exposed a lot of our poor infrastructure in ICT, especially for the urban poor. Again, this remains a key concern that in the event we are not able to conduct our businesses normally, can those in the urban areas be able to access? And therefore, we are trying to look at the possibility of making some of these services basic when it's not very prevalent. And particularly here in Kenya, we saw that and move forward. Again, the key lessons that we have learned and we think are going to be very important moving forward is the need to plan and replan our urban centers. If you look at our public transport terminal where people come and connect with the buses, with the trains, with the motorcycles and borders, as we call them here, they are very congested areas. And therefore, for Nakuru, one of the things we did was to reorganize, remove them, because in one particular stage, we had a daily traffic of about 4,000 people in about 3-4 acre land, which simply meant that the people who were coming there were too many and the risk of infection would be high. So the issue of replanning our urban infrastructure to be also in conformity with the possibility of such pandemics remains very critical. The idea of also encouraging outdoor infrastructure so that activities can be done outdoor, having open areas where children can go and play, go to worship, instead of the traditional enclosed areas, is also a matter that we have learned and we wish to move on in that direction. We're also looking at the social orientation to online solutions, and also to confirm that when government services and other related services go all online, the capacity or the ability of citizens to access those services is also a big issue, meaning that if they're not very well oriented in that respect, they are likely to be left out and therefore not benefit from those services. Again, we must also relook at our work environment, our previous work situations, the issue of proximity, social distancing, and all these other related issues during the pandemic has come to the fore. You had situations where in a factory, which is about maybe 20,000 square feet, you have about 1,000 people working there. That has to change. And the same goes also to the office environment, where even in our building and in our approvals now, the issue of bigger windows, more ventilation, and all those issues now become very critical in moving forward. Another key area that we have also seen is that during the pandemic, local authorities found themselves in a very awkward situation because the normal revenues that would be coming from businesses and trading activities around went down, which means the revenue went down, but on the other hand, there was increased resources required. So I think, again, from a planner's point of view, we saw a serious financial dent, and therefore delivery of services, being able to pay for for services that the county or the municipalities require became a major issue. And also that had an impact on cushioning of the socially disadvantaged persons. Lastly also is to mention on the issue of key sectors such as tourism. You have many urban centers and cities that are reliant on tourism, and when the pandemic hit, most of these closed. And again, due to the large numbers of persons who are employed directly and indirectly, that became a major problem. So I wish to end there on account of time, and again to thank the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Kinyanjui, once again for your remarks and highlighting the need to replan our urban centers. What does that look like in a practical sense? We'll get into that discussion. Also, a quick reminder to Committee on Permanent Representatives who are joining us virtually, some of you here also physically, please ready your questions for the panel. We'll be getting into the plenary session shortly. We have two more speakers. We have re-established connection with Mr. Tao from South Africa. If you can hear me, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible now.
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you very much once again. Thank you to the moderator. Your Excellencies, members of the Committee of Permanent Representatives, Director, ladies and gentlemen. I will make my input within the context of the Gauteng City region, which is a province in the South African context. And the
Mr. Tao, you can try again, please.
Apologies for that. It seems to be an interrupted signal coming from Mr. Tao. We'll try to establish a link with him a bit later on, but we must move on in the interest of time. Our next speaker is Balakrishnan Rajagopal, and he's a special rapporteur on adequate housing. He's also an associate professor of law and development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he'll be speaking on adequate housing in the center of achieving sustainable urban growth and protecting and empowering the most vulnerable groups in cities, including digital divide and digitalization of urban services.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I would like to thank UN Habitat for inviting me to speak at this important meeting. Over the past several years, UN Habitat has successfully offered a platform for local governments to exchange experiences and to strive for making urbanization more sustainable, with human rights at the heart of the effort in our cities and communities. The right to adequate housing enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is one of the core rights that determine if urbanization is indeed sustainable. Housing has been an essential frontline in the defense against COVID-19 pandemic. Stay-at-home orders underline how important access to adequate housing is to protect people and their communities from COVID-19. Physical distancing has been a key element in fighting the virus. But over 1.8 billion people across the world are currently living in inadequate and overcrowding housing conditions. And where will several hundred million people living in homelessness stay, and how can they be saved? For many, housing has indeed become a matter of life or death. However, before the pandemic, there were already other pandemics. A pandemic of forced evictions, homelessness, substandard housing, housing overcrowding, and other violations of the right to adequate housing. There has also been a pandemic of housing speculation with skyrocketing housing and land prices, making housing increasingly unaffordable for not only the poor, but for everyone else. When states adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, they vowed to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable by 2030. With only 10 years left, COVID-19 has exposed the fractures in the fabric of our cities and societies and made it very challenging to achieve these goals unless we search out for out-of-the-box solutions. As I pointed out last fall in my report to the UN General Assembly on COVID-19 and the right to adequate housing, what we can currently observe are the following. First, the impact of COVID-19 on the right to housing has been very unequally distributed, reflecting pre-existing hierarchies and inequalities along racial, gender, and other lines. Mortality and infection rates are significantly higher among minorities and other vulnerable groups. Inadequate housing conditions for millions of marginalized people have contributed to excessive, largely preventable death and suffering. Second, while the pandemic continues to rage, many temporary measures, including housing mitigation measures, have already come to an end or may soon do so. An unprecedented spike in evictions, hunger, homelessness, and eventually mortality is therefore to be expected. Third, forced evictions have continued, if not accelerated, during the pandemic. Homeless persons, persons who live in informal settlements, migrant workers, and other vulnerable groups are now facing worsening conditions with heightened risk of infection, community spread of the virus, and mortality. I've been pointing out that these outcomes can and should be avoided, and that a better approach to combating the worst impacts of COVID-19 on the right to housing is available and possible, and that local governments can play a key role in this respect. Many local governments have tried to bring housing as a human right and as a social and public good. More than 35 cities have endorsed a municipalist declaration of local governments for the right to housing and the right to the city, including Amsterdam, Barcelona, Berlin, Buenos Aires, Copenhagen, Geneva, Jakarta, Lisbon, London, Mexico City, Montreal, Montevideo, New York, Seoul, Taipei, and Vienna. Similarly, Guangzhou Guiding Principles for a Human Rights City have recognized that all levels of governments, national, regional, and local, have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights in their own mandates and competence, including the right to adequate housing, and endorse the human rights-based approach to urban governance. Networks like the United Cities and local governments and the Right to the City global platform have shown that with visionary rethinking and collective effort, it is possible to imagine alternative futures for a more sustainable and rights-compliant urbanization. But the pandemic has made it obvious that too many states, as well as public authorities at local levels, have treated the right to adequate housing rather as a nice aspirational goal, but not as a human right that must be realized on the ground. It is a sad fact that it took a pandemic to push many states and local governments to adopt more courageous measures by banning taxpayers, prohibiting rent increases, or providing housing for people experiencing homelessness in empty buildings, hotels, or hostels in our cities. Many of these measures were seen as politically difficult, if not impossible, before the pandemic. In many cities, things were suddenly possible, for which civil society organizations asked for many years, to provide water and sanitation facilities for informal settlements, to end street homelessness, to make serious efforts to prevent any evictions. What it shows is that if there is a political will, governments can indeed tackle these challenges. Unfortunately, many of these measures are temporary in nature, and in many countries have already come to an end or will do so soon. Neither COVID-19 nor its assault on the right to adequate housing will soon be over if local and national governments fail to take urgent action to prevent what is looming as temporary measures expire, a tsunami of evictions. Response and recovery measures at a local level. Let me conclude with some recommendations about what regional local governments can actually do. First, local governments should install local bans on evictions and foreclosures for the duration of the pandemic and build on those measures for a human rights compliant housing policy during the post-pandemic recovery phase, which is adequately funded. Until there are measures in place to protect the rights of renters and small non-corporate property owners, bans on evictions and foreclosures must continue. Second, local governments should ensure that the response and recovery measures are not discriminatory and leave no one behind, including those who are discriminated against on the basis of their gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, or socioeconomic status, or on other grounds. Groups who have been subjected to systemic and historic discrimination and marginalization must benefit from the response and recovery measures, and local governments must give ample time to adequately utilize resources to assist those who are at the risk of losing housing. Third, local governments should house people experiencing homelessness wherever and whatever accommodations they can find, in hotels, motels, second homes, or other vacant housing for the duration of the crisis, and make plans to move people to permanent housing rather than back onto the streets. Homelessness should be tackled through a sharp increase in the appropriation of funding for temporary housing and for the purchase or expropriation of temporary or vacant property for permanent housing. Local or regional governments could enact rent caps and subsidies for their needs to ensure stability in the housing market during and beyond the pandemic, so that a global health emergency does not become an eviction and housing emergency, which could also become a larger societal crisis. Finally, local and regional governments should constrain the role of private equity firms as landlords and improve the rights and protections of tenants and renters. This should include regulation of big corporate landlords as they seek to profit from the pandemic-induced after the 2008 global financial crisis. One sure way to counter that is to prohibit speculative investment and stronger legislation and government or judicial mechanisms protecting the rights of tenants. By taking steps now, we can not only mitigate the threats caused by the pandemic on the right to housing, but we will also be able to ensure that enough for all. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Mr. Rajagopal, for your comments. I'd like to try once more, Mr. Tao, as they say, 3 times the charm, to see if you'll be able to link with us now and make his remarks.
Works this time around.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So I was saying that the Gauteng region, which is the political, industrial, and commercial epicenter, includes the cities and metropolitan municipalities of Johannesburg and Pretoria, including that of Ekurhuleni, which is the industrial hub of the country. And it is home to an estimated 16 million people in 2020, with 8 out of 10 of these people living in an urban context. Gauteng is also a magnet for economic migrants at all levels because it is where South Africa's economy happens. The integrated urban development policy and the implementation of the district development model that seeks to ensure integrated planning and execution at the level of a district for all the 3 spheres of government in the country. The key levers of our integrated urban development framework are mobility, human settlements, urban infrastructure, land governance,
Unfortunately, we have lost Mr. Tao once again. We'll try to link up with him during the question and answer. Again, a reminder to our Committee on Permanent Representatives, if you have your questions ready, please have them on standby as we get into a very quick panel discussion. Time is not on our side, but we'll try to get through as much as we can. Just to reflect on some of the comments made in this past session, let me begin with you, Dr. Kruger, and I hope I'm audible on your end. You talked about integrating health in building urban environments. And this kind of ties into a comment made by Eduardo urban weak spots to deal with future shocks that look like? If you're talking to urban planners, if you're talking to policymakers, city developers and planners, how do they integrate health in a practical sense when thinking through urban environments?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Victoria. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for that question, because I think it's so important. In an ideal world, of course, we would start from scratch and build a city where we can transport ourselves in a very healthy way, which means walk and cycle. That means the distance between our house and the store or the school or the workplace is manageable and can be reached in 10, 15 minutes, like the effort that we're seeing in Paris right now to address that. It's a city where we think about the quality of our air and therefore ensure regulations on that issue, both on transportation, but also on the industrial side. It's a city where we think about our children being able to play, having playgrounds, having green spaces, etc., where we think about our mental health, again, green spaces, opportunities to get outside, etc. So of course, we are not in the ideal world. We cannot start all of our cities from scratch, but we can certainly relatively easily, in some cases, retrofit some of that. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, because the pandemic has been terrible in terms of the death and the economic crisis it's causing, but it has brought us some lessons, and many cities have taken positive steps. Some of the biggest and oldest cities like Paris, lanes, opportunities for walking, better public transport. There are lessons we are learning, replicated in other places. We're also taking the opportunity in our cities and think about the homeless, think about the poorest people who don't have access to the same services as others, and giving them a chance. And some cities, I'm thinking, for example, Bogota or other cities in Colombia, have thought about out during this recovery phase. So I can go on and on and on, but I think my main point is, let's learn from some of the good examples and the good lessons.
Thank you, Dr. Krug, for that. I'd like to bring in Governor Kinyanjui. And on something you said, the need to replan our urban centers. I mean, when you think about sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, as of 2018, more than half of the urban population is estimated to be living in slums. So you're looking at people who are living in spaces that were not planned for them. When you're looking at the African context, what needs to be done as you're looking at that bigger picture?
Mr. Kinyanjui, you should be able to speak.
That replanning is not as easy as we probably would say it, but it requires concerted effort, including also whenever we are approving buildings, we can be able to look at certain aspects of planning, whether they are social places, whether they are residential places, in our public transport systems. What can we learn out of this whole conversation? And again, the issue of sanitation is a standard practice across all these things. So I think the first thing we need to do is our planners, our architects, our engineers, that whole entire planning department requires to rethink and to find how we can be able to look at the issue of pandemic as a potential risk that can come any one time, and for that reason to be able to prepare for it. Secondly, is also a mindset issue that even for when you're planning our housing, be it affordable housing, low-income housing, high-income sort of housing, we also leave open spaces where people can play, where people can be out. And should you be required to be indoors for a whole day or 2 days or 3 days, Again, it should also be possible for you to be able to remain indoors without also having psychological challenges, because sometimes when people are caged too much, you begin to have other issues. So I think it will involve all planners, including social workers, including psychologists, planners, architects, and all these entire people. And I think that's a conversation that must begin now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Governor Kinyanjui. Moving on to Professor Mazakuto, and I want to just broaden something you talked about. When it came to governments, especially local governments and their response to the pandemic, in many cases, they lacked the tools, the budget, or even the autonomy to respond adequately. How can we, moving forward, deal with scenarios and structures like that, especially from a policy perspective, to ensure that cities, regions, countries are able to respond more adequately, even with policy constraints as what we've seen during the pandemic?
Ms. Matsukato?
Yes.
Yes, I
Okay,
can see you now.
Me the opportunity to again focus on the positive. So in the part of London where I live in Camden, I've been chairing the Camden Renewal Commission with the council leader Georgia Gould. So this is a very even a more local area than a city. London has actually adopted across the board this perspective that we have in the Institute around mission-oriented policies, and Camden Council has actually been leading the way. There's 4 missions currently that it set itself by 2025. Every young person will have access to economic opportunity that enables them to be safe and secure. This is hugely important in cities also with a lot of youth violence, as London has had recently, on the back of the austerity we had for 10 years. Second, by 2030, those holding positions of power in Camden are going to be as diverse as our community, and the next generation is ready to follow. Third, by 2030, everyone will eat well every day, nutritious, affordable, and sustainable food. And this particular mission, for example, is going at the center of schools and school meals, something that, by the way, Sweden has been leading a fossil-free welfare state, which then they've landed on really concrete structures around public transport, public housing, public education. So school meals, as I was mentioning, can be a funnel through the procurement process of innovation, of sustainability, of inclusion. And lastly, by 2030, Camden's estates, housing estates, and their neighborhoods will be healthy and sustainable. And this fourth one, I think, is really important in terms of also asking, who sets these missions? How do we do outcomes-oriented policy, purpose-oriented policy? Where are the decisions made? And so really bringing to the table in this ex-ante way, not just ex-post, asking people what they thought of a process, but ex-ante actually designing, another word I used in my introductory remarks, designing kind of public purpose-oriented missions with people actually living, for example, in a city, in the housing estate. So resident associations, citizen assemblies, which in the UK, for example, became very active around the debate around Brexit. They can also be really important around actually redesigning the tools that we need to actually foster more inclusive and sustainable growth. But that has to happen, again, by actually doing something that an artist, Olafur Eliasson, a Danish artist, says, that public space should be a space where you feel safe to disagree. Think of all the kind of unsafe ways to disagree on social media, having these discussions about co-creation, using missions around, healthy, sustainable school meals, carbon neutral housing estates, but bringing the students in the schools involved, bringing housing associations involved. My experience is that this co-creation bit is the hardest part. It's easy to come up with great policies. It's much harder actually to create a process that actually makes sure that it truly is stakeholder driven. But I do think that the 21st century has to deliver that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Now, in the interest of time, allow me to open the floor now to some questions from our CPR members. We have Mr. Mohammed from the University of East London, who is seeking the floor. And please, a quick disclaimer, if you can keep your comments or questions to under a minute, 2 minutes if you're pushing it. We want to make sure that we get as much feedback from our delegates this afternoon. Mr. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent session. At various fora where we have analyzed this report, we've talked about how it's all about rethinking our strategies, about resources and about people. And in fact, I'm just going to follow up on the professor's point about co-creation. Who are the creators? Who are the stakeholders? I speak on behalf of the UN Habitat Stakeholders Advisory Group Enterprise, where we are mapping our stakeholders and also finding out that during this pandemic, who are the voices that we've missed? What are the resources we need to create capacities? And also how we can have the policies that work really for the people who need them the most. So I wonder if any of the speakers could actually advise us how we need to relook our multi-stakeholder engagement to ensure that we have both the voices that are needed as well as the champions to drive this process to the new normal.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed from the University of East London. Next up, we have the representative of Costa Rica. Again, kindly keep your questions to 2 minutes. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I will try and keep my intervention below 2 minutes. First, Costa Rican delegation would really like to due to its utmost relevance for every urban geographical area of the planet. I would also like to thank the panelists, Dr. Lopez Moreno, Dr. Krug, Professor Matsukato, Mr. Tao, Governor Kinyanjui, and Mr. Rajagopal for their extremely enlightening presentations. In this regard, I wanted to share an initiative that Costa Rica launched last June 5th as part of the Environment Day celebrations. And this initiative is our first national Urban Environment Agenda, which is a high-level interministerial coordination mechanism with intersectoral actions conceived to prioritize, follow up, monitor, and evaluate the main strategic interventions in the cities which are of mutual interest to the Ministry of Environment, by which they seek to protect, preserve, and manage biodiversity and improve the health and well-being of all the population. Consequently, the strategic interventions contemplated in this agenda are aimed at promoting a healthy coexistence between natural and artificial spaces, as well as human settlements and biodiversity under the framework of a healthy and environmentally balanced environment as ordered by our political constitution and taking into consideration the full protection of human rights. Increasing population, growing demand for resources, and disorderly urbanization are events that intensify the effects of climate change and generate multiple challenges, including safe, accessible, resilient, and sustainable human settlements, development of green infrastructure, universal access for green spaces that contribute to people's well-being and that can serve as a buffer to improve disaster risk management, attractive and livable urban landscapes that integrate ecosystem services, protection of freshwater ecosystems, and sustainable use of water resources. All of the aforementioned now being worsened by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the main actions that Costa Rica has taken to fulfill the needs of population in a sustainable way include our national decarbonization plan, which factors that make cities resilient to climate change, such as green and blue infrastructure, sustainable mobility, and risk management. Number 2, resilient urban territories that promote biodiversity. Number 3, technological innovation and research development and consolidation of technological platforms that allow access and exchange of environmental and territorial geostatistical information, generating synergies for research that improve decision-making in the territory. Governance and financing carried out jointly in order to ensure regulations that facilitate, promote, and strengthen the achievement of the objectives of our interurban agenda. Urban municipalities will be able to make better environmental decisions and propose actions that connect forest areas along the rivers or expand existing green spaces. The National Urban Environment Agenda will also allow institutions and local governments to coordinate more closely to create urban natural parks, which will be part of the new interurban biological corridor, and to carry out interventions in strategic neighborhoods of the greater metropolitan area. And that 60% of Costa Rica's population lives in area, and which is only 4% of the total country's territory. So this can give you an idea of the extreme high density of the population in the GAM. Costa Rica has focused on biodiversity management and protection for over 4 decades. The time has come now to coordinate with other actors in order to bring nature's ecosystems to our cities. I would kindly request the distinguished panelists if they can share inputs, observations, or recommendations regarding our National Urban Environment Agenda, which could enhance the implementation of this very important initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative of Costa Rica, for your submissions. And the question to the panelists on their thoughts on the National Urban Environment Strategy in Costa Rica, I think I will direct the first response to Dr. Krug, followed by Professor Mazzucato.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question. Participation. I think one of the key things we need to emphasize more, develop more, is to give space to the stakeholders, particularly civil society organizations. We need to build cities for so many different people. We need to build cities for children, but also cities for older people, for people with disabilities, for all of these groups. I think need to get a space around the table in order to plan our cities better and in a more inclusive and equitable way. When we talk about planning and to respond also to the Costa Rican delegate, I think what I really liked was even the title of the plan that Costa Rica has developed, because it talks about the national level working with the city level. And I think that the vertical integration is also a very important element we haven't talked about very much. But cities in isolation can do a number of things, but cannot address the full problem. So facilitating that integration is also important. I'll stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you, Dr. Krug. Professor Mazzucato, floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm here. Good. So the first question on stakeholder, issues. I think it's easy to talk about stakeholders. It's much harder actually to develop a serious plan for how to do it. And I think it has to begin with the notion of value as created collectively. If you look at the business community, the business roundtable, these very large companies that are talking about stakeholder capitalism, that we need to move away from shareholder maximization. Unfortunately, it is often almost seen as charity, right? Companies still are seen as the only value creators, and the idea is that they should disseminate and distribute this value to more people than just the shareholders, which of course is a good idea, but it's never going to work unless it's actually founded on a different story, a different narrative, a different discourse, a different way to create that value in the first place. And if you look at what trade unions are currently fighting for, which is a just transition, so as we transition to a greener economy, we need to be investing in workers to transition and to adapt along the way. Same thing you could argue for the digital revolution. Again, it's not enough. those voices at the table in the first place to even talk about what do we mean by sustainability in a city? How do we bring citizens together to actually create a discussion about how do we want to live together? What does it mean to live together in a sustainable way? And the Costa Rican question was so important because the National Urban Environmental Agenda needs to also begin with a new narrative and story about this is not a trade-off to do either, sustainability or to do economic growth. Cities can be at the forefront of creating new opportunities, new sorts of services, sectors, collaborations, ways of living together, public spaces, as I was talking about before, that have a sustainability as the direction, embedded also within the contracts of how developers work together. And that can create a different form of growth. It's not about no growth, but it is about a very different type of direction of growth. And, really, I do think in many ways cities have been at the forefront of this, but unfortunately, sometimes it's not actually embedded within the economic agenda. So having the economy and the environment really be working hand in hand, not in a trade-off kind of way, but really with the focus on new opportunities and new ways of living together, I think is a very important point.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to move on to a submission from the representative of Colombia. The representative from Colombia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Every day the pandemic presents new challenges for us. Economic situation in our countries have been deeply affected and require new and special way to address them. And we have to be more innovative and understand that the new challenges in our countries, that there are new challenges in our countries, but most of all in our cities. Yes, challenges such as the ones we have been working, affordable housing, public services, clean and drinking water, will continue to be in the public agenda. Now, important challenges should be addressed, such as new opportunities for the young population, especially in the urban areas, and security in our cities. This has to be addressed and is an urgent matter. And young people in this matter. As we just heard, now we have to also address health, absolutely linked with the way we are handling the environment. Colombia thanks the opportunity for these discussions, but we must include and have innovative ways to challenge us and give solution in the floor, in the territory for these new opportunities. Matters as information, technology, financing, nature-based solutions, as others shall be included in this new agenda. How can we do that? Thank you so much.
Thank you, the representative from Costa Rica, for your question to the panel. I beg your pardon, Colombia. Thank you for your submission and question. I will now field that to the panel once more. Dr. Krug, you may respond.
I'm sorry, I'm having some audio problems. I did not hear the question. I'm really sorry about that. Can you repeat it?
The representative from Colombia, please repeat the question.
New challenges are here with us, especially regarding young population in urban areas, health, of course, and security in the cities. How can we include the young population and have these new answers that they deserve and new opportunities they need? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent point. Youth are particularly affected by this pandemic right now and have been a key participant in city life, which has been affected by injuries, by violence, by lack of employment, by drugs, by a number of challenges which we have tried to resolve for them without often involving them enough. So I think including youth in the dialogue to discuss not only the problems but also the solutions is extremely important. We've seen emergence of youth NGOs in many cities. We've seen participation and inclusion of young people in political life, sometimes as elected officials or otherwise consulted, at least in decision making. I think grooming young people to become early on leaders and if possible elected leaders is an extremely important step in order to in finding the solutions to these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Krug. I think we'll give the question as well to Governor Kinyanjui, considering the huge youth population here in Africa, 60% under the age of 25. How do we tap into that resource?
So thank you very much. And I want to confirm that the issue of youth inclusivity in programs within the urban setup remains a key concern, partly because they have a way of looking at things, they have a way of doing things that is unique to them. And therefore, if we do not capture them, then we will completely lose them altogether. And therefore, we need to look for ways of ensuring that the skills they have, especially skills to do with ICT and more dynamic sort of skills that they've acquired, given the times that we are in, are also included. So the language we speak, the mode of communication that we have, the sort of forums that we engage the youth, I think must also be there. It's also critical to note that for there to be sustainability in urban planning and sustainability, the youth must be part and part of the conversation, because the tradition has been that the key decision makers are essentially the older, more experienced municipal managers and the big people. And with that, they can only carry as much as they know. And therefore, we are losing a very critical part of the community that also has very good ideas. And previous engagement has shown that the youth also have a capacity and the willingness to participate in decision making. And I think also the saying that no decisions about us without us is really very practical when it comes to the young people. So we must come up with creative ways to ensure that our young people are included in the conversation. Thank you.